Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And I always feel a little bit nervous following speakers like Natalie because that was fantastic. And I'll tell you why in my presentation, why we think it's so important that MLA does what they do and how important it is. So we're going to talk about the Angus Premium, and I can give you the really short version, and that is, yes, you've got a premium. But what I want to do today is talk to you more about some of the things that we think about. What does it mean? Firstly, what is it? How can we define it? And why is it important? And then perhaps look to the future a bit. And where does this idea of your particular cattle having a premium, and where can it go? And so I thank you for the opportunity. I just want to tell you a little bit about this is how we do things. So it'll help give you context about how we come up with this view. So it's not just somebody like Edward Deming says there, if you haven't got data, you're just another person with an opinion. So we don't want to be just another person with an opinion. We want to explain what we do, and we start with data. And that's why in our industry, in our red meat industry, having someone like MLA aggregating and collecting that data is fantastic for the industry, but in our space, in our personal space, it's absolutely vital for our business. And then you can add information to it. You can add what's happening in the industry. So an example might be today that the market data is telling us something, but the information behind it is that there's a lot of females being slaughtered, or that we've got some areas that are that had a flood, or some are in drought, or all sorts of things that are impacting on that market. So you need that information. But up until that point, the data and the information is fairly public and fairly well available to anybody. So it's not really valuable. It's what happens next, and that's where we start to apply the knowledge of what does it mean? Have we seen this happen before? What's our take on it? What's the analysis of it? And then right at the top, you can see that we call it the wisdom, and that means you actually take all of those steps and say, well, okay, not what does it mean in general, but what does it mean for a business or a client or an industry? So take it more specific. A bit of context, and it follows on a little bit from what Natalie's been saying, and there's one slide I'm just going to slip right across now because she's already covered it. But we're in a really fortunate space in Australia. You know, we have this massive growing population that was talked about just before. Half the world's population lives in that little bubble there, and we're right beside it. There's a little bit more to it though. They're getting richer, and as I said, I won't dwell on this, you saw this, but if you have a look at China today, in 2018, there's 12.5 million households that have got $35,000 disposable. Have a look what happens in 4 years' time, it more than doubles. So that's the sort of people who are going to be... We know in the past that when these countries go from third world status into developing world into first world status, they consume more proteins and they consume more fats and they consume more carbohydrates. But those countries in the past have been small countries. Now we've got these big populations moving that direction. So it's a real positive. But Natalie touched on this, and this is a bit more MLA research, and I was discussing this with Natalie before and getting a little bit more insights into it, but it's what the Chinese customer's looking for. And Natalie's already touched on it to some degree, but we know now that these aren't your average customers who are coming out of third world status and just want to get some meat. They're customers who are informed. They're customers who know that there are different qualities. And so what this research is telling us is that things like the country of origin are more important than price. Things like animal welfare is more important than freshness. And it was interesting. I was asking Natalie about that bit of research, and the reason freshness isn't that important is because in these developing countries, if something's not frozen, there's the perception that maybe it spent some of its life in the supply chain where it wasn't really cold either. So there's that. So being frozen is quite a positive step. The other part is that do they know where the good quality meat comes from? And we hear about our competitors. I mean, the biggest exporter of beef protein in the world is India, but they understand that the products that we're turning out are different and can be identified as different. Now, there's a reason why we're talking about all this is because, and we saw before, these markets, these export markets, are absolutely the future of our industries in Australia. We know that. And if you want a reference back in time, think back to the 1970s drought when we were shooting cattle and shooting sheep. Think back to what's possibly one of the worst droughts we've just had, and the value of our stock was maintained even though we slaughtered huge amounts. And the difference between 1970 and now has been the development of export markets. So somebody, MLA can take claim for it, or the processors, or somebody can take claim for it, doesn't matter. It's been that development that is actually giving us now these opportunities. What do we got here? 70% of our domestic processing goes to exports. And if you have a look there, China at the moment is taking 10%. I'm going to use China as an example. Everybody does, so we'll stick with that. It's a growing market, but just having a look, whoops, hit that one a little bit quick. In the last quarter, the first quarter of this year, the traditional markets ticked along pretty much. You know, they didn't do anything spectacular. But have a look what's happened to China. And if we drill down a little bit more into that, here's the Japanese grain-fed exports to Japan. You can see fresh and frozen, fairly stable, we know that. A very important market, but, you know, a mature and well-established market. This is South Korea, a more recent market, but now becoming mature and stable. And here's the China chart. So we can see that that big population is getting to know what we've got. And they're getting to know that we've got not only beef protein and sheep meats as well, but they're getting to know that we've got quality meat. So the growth in demand is, I think Matt put this slide up for me, it took China less than a decade to match South Korean volumes. You know, we've now got the trend is going to show that they're going to go past them, and when we couple that with the expanding population and that demand, then we can see that we've got someone on our doorstep who's going to be banging away there and saying, give us the product. So let's talk about premiums. And I'm taking a risk here, putting the W word up here. But I must say, I can't remember, where was the conference last year? Oh, it was last year. 2 years ago, that's right. Okay, so that's where I was. And one of the things I remember was talking to people and coming away thinking there's a hell of a lot of Angus people who are going to actually mate cattle to Wagyus. And if you have a look, that was in 2017. And the reason that was the case was the premium for Wagyu over the EYCI, so we'll use the EYCI as a benchmark, the premium for Wagyus at that point was extreme. You can see that. If we look at the next slide, it's in percentage terms. You can see that at times it was running at 100% over and above the EYCI. Now what happened was that supply increased. And not only did supply increase, but quality decreased. And keep this in mind, this is context for what I'm going to tell you down the track, the good stuff. There was a flood of mediocre Wagyus around. And at the same time, the industry was unable to grow the market quickly enough to take advantage of that. And so now you can see where the premium is. There's a little bit of a kick on the end of it, Matt, I think, at the moment. It's improved a little bit, but you can see what happens in a market. So premiums and the sort of extra value you can get out of things aren't a given forever. And this is an example of that. But let's go to the good news. And that's Angus. So what we've done, or what we do, and it's funny, you've got two people standing up here the last session saying they love data and they build their business around data. Well, we love tracking this sort of stuff. We use Auctions Plus as the best measurement of how do different breeds compare for price, because it's really the only place where the breed is recorded accurately against prices. So in this case, we're looking at the longer term, or the price from 2015 for 100% Angus. So these are cattle on Auctions Plus that have an Angus sire and an Angus dam. And we're comparing it against other cattle that have no Angus in them. So we're trying to compare apples against oranges, if you like, but trying to make sure that we're not blurring the water. So on the one hand, we've got mum and dad are Angus. On the other hand, we've got mum and dad are not Angus, and we're comparing that. So that's the orange chart, and the grey one at the bottom is the Eastern Young Cattle Indicator, and that's just a general benchmark that we use. So let's drill into that a little bit. So here's the difference, or the spread, in cents per kilogram for pure Angus cattle against the others over this period. So what we've done to sort of to narrow down the range, we've just said, first of all, let's look at steers and heifers, and secondly, let's look at 200 to 400 kilogram weight range live weight. So the average premium in cents per kilogram over that period is 25 cents live weight. Now, I've got some real tech heads in the office, and they say, I've got to explain this. Matt said, I've got to explain this, so here we go. So the grey bit is the 70% range. So for 70% of the time, the premium sits between that. And what it means is that's the, if it's inside of that, it's considered sort of normal. When it gets outside, that's when you sort of say that's abnormal. So for 70% of the time, the premium has been between 12 cents and 38 cents live weight. Did I get that right? Thank you. If we look at it in percentage terms, which is probably another good way to look at it, the average premium has been an 8% premium for those same cattle, and the range, so for most of the time, it's been somewhere between 5% and 13% premium. So a good story. In fact, a great story. If you think about that, everybody else is missing out on that, if you like, or depends what you call it. Are they getting a discount or are you getting a premium? But it's nice to be where you are. So let's talk a little bit about the future of this, and this is where we will go out on a little bit of a limb and say, what we've shown you there, to be honest, is just facts and figures, and that's data. But let's try and read into that a little bit about what's ahead because of what you've got, the premiums that you've got. And as we saw that's why I put up the example of the Wagyu, and that's why I talked about the markets and followed on from what Natalie said about what markets are looking for. What are the risks and what are the opportunities? Well, one of the risks is this guarantee of provenance. And you saw in Natalie's presentation, one of the important things is, where does the animal come from? How was it treated? What was its welfare? The risk of provenance. And we hear that all the time. And it's a risk if we don't do it because somebody else will do it, but it's also an opportunity if you can create that transparent traceability. Has anybody bought any, what's that wool thing from New Zealand, Icebreaker? With Icebreaker, you take your barcode, you scan it onto something, and it will actually take you and show you a video of the place where that wool came from. Now, it doesn't make it any better, it doesn't make it any different. It's that provenance that people are talking about. It's that comfort, it's that level of confidence they've got that the product they're getting, has got some history. It has been treated well. It is safe, it's healthy, it's all those sort of things. Another risk is quality assurance. And one of the risks when you have an industry premium or an industry brand is that everybody's in. And I'll show you a short video in a minute. I'm trusting my man up there at the behind the screen that we can turn it on. If you want to actually get the true value over a longer term, you have to be able to describe in the future what is the benefit, what is the value. So the opportunity is to define those parameters. And we saw last night, the steak we had last night and the beef cheeks, that sort of thing. I wasn't eating them and thinking it's an Angus. I was eating them and thinking this is a bloody good piece of meat. And that's what people will look for. How can we actually guarantee that every time they take your product, that they get that outcome? Because if they don't, if it's a bad outcome, then you're damaging your brand. You're running risk of people not seeing the benefit. So that quality assurance and defining those quality parameters is something that brands need to think of longer term. There was, if you think back to when we had a branded product going into Japan, this is going back a little while, and somebody actually stuck some kangaroo in that box. Remember the roux and the stew? That went into a branded product. But because the quality assurance wasn't in place, the brand was compromised. Now, that's an extreme example, but I'm saying that the way to manage that, the way to manage the risk and add to the opportunity. Remember, if you're adding to the opportunity, you're making it harder for other people to come behind you, you're making it harder for people to catch up, then this is an area of quality that you need to look at. The other one, and this sounds a little bit contradictory, but the advancement in objective measurement. So that measurement of meat quality is not measuring whether it's Angus or Hereford. It's measuring the qualities of the meat. So that's a risk for you when you're out there in front, because if everybody else says, okay, our qualities are the same as yours, then they're going to catch up. So you might have picked up on one side we've got risk, and the other side we've got opportunities. The opportunity is for you to actually continue to refine and move this brand and this premium forward. When you're at the front of the race, everyone's got to catch you, and it's much easier to be there. But if you think that what's happened in the past is going to be enough to keep you there for the future, trust me, it's a risk. Now, I'm going to show you, there's a bit of risk involved in this whole thing, because I'm going to show you a short video, and it's a US branded product. But if you think about what I've just said then, and just watch this, it's a minute and a half, I think it goes.
Angus beef. You hear a lot about it these days, as it's become something of a generic term for quality. But is it really that simple? And what makes the certified Angus beef brand superior to other Angus beef? To answer those questions, let's begin with what Angus is. A breed of cattle known for its potential to produce really good beef. However, merely using Angus cattle, as many brands do, isn't enough to ensure a great tasting cut of meat. That's why at the Certified Angus Beef brand, we start with Angus, and then apply our 10 rigorous standards for flavor, tenderness, and juiciness. We also closely examine the marbling in every cut of beef, because those tiny white flecks are what give it its mouth-watering flavor. We want to make certain they are numerous and evenly distributed, so that they melt during cooking. That way, your first bite is as delicious as your last. How picky are we when it comes to beef? So picky that only 3 in 10 Angus cattle are good enough to earn the Certified Angus Beef brand label. What happens to the other 7? Well, you'll find them labeled as Angus beef in general, or marketed under other Angus brand names. To put it simply, we bring the highest quality Angus beef to the table, your table. So look for the logo, because it's not just Angus, it's the Certified Angus Beef brand.
So thanks very much for that. That was well done. And I saw some guy coming down the stairs. I thought, geez, he's going to come down and job me or something. We're putting up something about the Americans. But think of it in the context of what we're talking about. It's not just about Angus beef in this brand. It's saying we're going to tell you what are the special qualities. And that goes to the provenance. People can have confidence that that beef is selected, that it's run in a certain way. So they're the next steps. You guys are to be congratulated because you were the original guys who actually marketed a brand and a breed. But what I'm saying is that the world is going very fast, and that's the sort of things that they're looking for. So before I ask any questions, just to round up, thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you for listening and staying here. I just want to give ourselves a plug. We run the Mecardo Commodity Conversations, and there's the, I reckon that's a great marketing line. It's the backstory in agricultural markets, the ins and outs of agricultural industry and the issues. So far we've covered things like social licence, live export, ag tech, the election, before the election, and if you'd like to subscribe, we'd love to have you on board. But thank you very much, and well done on a great conference.
Thank you, Robert. So is there any questions for Robert? Got a mic over to Peter, please? Yeah.
Yes, Robert, 2 questions actually. First, the NLIS system in Australia, where every animal has an individual identification, should that not be the way we do our tracing for provenance? Would that work?
It would. It would. can you remember your second question and if I answer your first one?
Yes.
Okay, because that is something that the cattle industry, the NIS electronic tagging system is unique in the world. And if you think back, Japan, the US just got full access back into Japan. 15 years after, they found one cow that came from Canada with a disease that Japan wasn't happy about. They ended up finding 6, but the problem was they couldn't work out where they'd been. So the traceability that we have is not only going to be fantastic when and if something happens, but it gives our customers a lot of confidence, and it should be a real marketing tool. That said, this gives me the chance to get on my other soapbox. What the hell is the sheep industry doing by not embracing it? I mean, Victoria has it and the rest of Australia doesn't have it. It's crazy, and it's a risk, because if and when something happens, then that will be our godsend. Thank you.
Second question was regarding the EU and the UK and Brexit. There's 3 scenarios. I mean, there may be another vote and the EU, UK stays in the EU. That's a possibility, from what Theresa May said the other day. Secondly, they could crash out. Or thirdly, there would be a £2 trillion settlement. On each of those scenarios, where do you see our beef exports in 3-4 years' time to the EU and the UK?
Well, I'll be really honest and say that would be a question too difficult. There's people getting paid a lot more than me who won't be able to answer that. One thing I will say, though, is what we know is that political upheaval and disruption is not good for trading. And we've just seen, I don't know whether anyone's been selling any wool this week, we've seen a market collapse to some degree this week. And if you're trying to find out reasons for it, it's lack of confidence. And so markets need confidence and they don't need this upheaval. So 3 or 4 years 3 or 4 years is enough time for markets to recover. So that's hard to predict. But what I will say is in the short term, if something like that happens, then it's a problem. The good thing for Australia's red meat industry is that if you have a look at the diversity of markets, we're spread across a huge range of markets, and that is a real asset for us. And again, we don't get paid by MLA. We've tried a few times, but I've got to say, we are very blessed in Australia, if you think about it, to have an organisation that has the broad range of, broad charter to not only provide services and market reporting, but to actually be out there and talking about it. And that customer stuff that Natalie put up there, we were quizzing her and see if we could get it, and she said, you can't have it, but I'll tell people about it, but you can't have it because it is so important. And that's where it's great to be in an industry where we have this cutting-edge marketing and technology, because we know the rest of the world is not that organised, is a bit more chaotic, and so we're one step ahead. Thanks for your question.
Do you see our Angus brand of meat being broken down further, like the US example was, like a sort of a fractured brand?
Yep, it's a good question. I've been breeding cattle and sheep in a sort of not scientifically. So I don't know a lot about the breeds and the genetics, and I look at all this stuff with looks like a bit of smoke and mirrors to me. But I'm pretty sure not all Angus is Angus. Not all Angus is good Angus. Just like not all Wagyu is Wagyu. So do you want to be, in the end, if I can be a bit provocative, you'll be as good as your lowest contributor. So that tells me that if you want premiums to keep moving ahead, because remember, everybody's trying to get to where you are, if you want your premiums to be moving ahead, then perhaps what you've got to do is start identifying what is the leader. And you, in a funny way, I suspect you're already doing that with your breeding. So why not with your marketing? It'd be a bit like me coming along and saying, well, all Angus bulls are worth the same money. They're clearly not. And so with this providence and with this traceability and with this need for the customer to know, the consumer to know what's going on, then you've got this opportunity now. And we heard this morning in this room here about social media and technology and how we can get our message across. We've now got this opportunity to keep saying, yeah, we've got a great breed and it's a great animal, but within that we've got another product and it's fantastic and it's better. And without saying it, you're telling them, and you've got to pay more for it. So the short answer is, I think yes, you need I think that's what will happen in the future. And I'm not here to provide advice to whoever runs the branding, but I think that's what will happen. And the other thing, we go back to my earlier point, you need to be able to control the quality of a brand. Up until now, I suspect your competition wasn't that great in identifying the Angus difference in the Angus brand. The competition was floundering. That won't be the same forever. And so you will need to sort of step up, and I think that's the way to go.
Thanks, Robert. Another question over here.
This will be hard, this one.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably not. Thanks, Robert. I'm just wondering on that subject of qualities within the breed, whether on that chart where you had the grey box, which was the 12% of variation to give you average, was the graph. Have you got a high and a low? Because the early adopters of genomics and other things that are taking Angus forward, or hopefully taking Angus forward, probably need to know what the differential is for reward there.
Yeah, so what you're saying is where we said that was the range of premiums and then you had a bit outside it and all that, have we got it for it, the next quality up? No. And we're damn lucky we've actually got it for that, because where else is, apart from Auctions Plus, nobody else actually records when animals go through the market and publishes it, whether they're Angus or Hereford or whatever. So, but that's the next stage, and it goes to your question, when we start to actually, get paid for meat quality and meat yield and all those sort of things, not only will we need to try and extract value out of it, one of the ways you extracted value out of it is by having that information publicly available, so that then you can say to your customer, in this case you can say, well, my quality is here, the average market is there, therefore I need to know where my premium is, or I need to negotiate where my premium is. But unfortunately, Richard, that sort of definition of product and price is not there at the moment, but there's nothing stopping it. The technology, if you think about wool, in a wool sale, wool is you can break down wool to, tensile strength, length, vegetable matter. There's a whole lot of things which all go in to make up the value. And you can actually pluck it apart and say, well, if I have wool that's 40 newtons, it's worth more than by X amount than wool that's worth 33. And so that's the sort of areas that technology will take us. It's a bit confronting and challenging, but our industries here, we're fortunate. I mean, we've got MLA, you've got Angus Australia, you've got these people who have got the capacity to manage that. We just have to be able to say, yes, we can identify it, and it has a value. It's a bit like identifying free-range eggs against cage eggs. If you look at these two eggs, they look the same, but they're worth different money, but they have to be traceable to be able to identify where that different value is.
Thanks very much, Robert. I think we've exhausted the questions
Exhausted
for now.
me.
But exhausted you, and thank you very much. And thanks to the audience for the challenging questions, not only at this session but throughout the conference. You really challenged our speakers and got the most out of them. So much appreciated, Robert. And I noticed Matt's in the audience there as well as the backup behind a lot of this analysis. You've certainly got me as a subscriber, and I get great value out of it. So thank you very much.
Thanks for the plug. Thanks, Peter.